Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 33. I am your show's host, Kyle, and today we're going to cover the first 99 days of Trump. I'm sure all the mainstream media will be out this weekend giving you the coverage of the first 100 days of Trump, but all that'll be garbage anyway, so take Foreign Policy Focus 33, 99 days of Trump, and share it with everybody, and maybe getting the content out there a day earlier will help me to spread the show a little bit more. So if you are sharing the show, thank you so much, and now I'm going to get into it. Just to go back and remind everybody, before the election, before Trump took office, his foreign policy looked a lot different, certainly than what we're experiencing today. Before the election, we hear things from Trump like NATO is obsolete, that he doesn't understand why we're attacking Assad. He kind of, has the attitude that we're going to take out ISIS, but we're not going to overthrow all these dictators and do regime changes anymore. No more Libya, no more Syria, no more Iraq. It's all going to be good wars. He surrounds himself on foreign policy with people like Flynn and Bannon, who certainly were not somebody I would ever want to be in a position of power in America, or I think are good people. However, they weren't wrong on every single issue, and some of the people that he's now surrounded with are, and so I think Trump was right on some issues. Once he takes office that first weekend, he really takes his word of knocking the hell out of ISIS seriously. I think he drops some like 70 airstrikes total on ISIS throughout the region, and at least for the first weekend. I mean, while Trump's foreign policy was bloody and bad, it certainly wasn't as bad as it's gonna get. In that first weekend as well, we get Trump pulling out of the TPP, which, trade war does have some foreign policy implications, but I didn't cover it much on this show, and I don't think it was anything unexpected or too important. We also have Trump passing the travel ban, and one of my first shows was actually covering how Clinton, Bush, and Obama are really the cause of the travel ban. If you want to be upset about the travel ban, looking towards the foreign policy, but you have that coming in the first weekend, of course, pretty quickly getting overturned by the courts. I think Trump may have learned something from the implementation from the travel ban. I think one of the worst parts about it was really how poorly it was implemented. It seemed like some departments were doing one thing, other departments were doing others. He obviously didn't warn about it, so I think he was looking at it from a logistical point of view, thinking that if he says it's going to happen in a week, then everybody's going to rush in. So what I need to do is just surprise everyone with it. However, that created just all kinds of problems, and so rightfully the travel ban was overturned by the court. Then you have him implementing a second travel ban later, with that being quickly overturned by the court as well. Trump may have learned something about how clunky government is then. He then had a conversation with, I believe it was the Saudi crown prince, who talked Trump into agreeing on safe zones in Yemen and Syria. Of course, these safe zones would be places where the Al-Qaeda linked terrorists could hide out and conduct attacks against Assad and against the Houthis in Yemen. The safe zones are essentially no-fly zones and may require the U.S. to have confrontation with Russia if these are ever put in place. I haven't heard too much about it since, so I'm guessing the issue was dropped and maybe either logistically it couldn't happen or Trump's personnel decided against it. Early on in the presidency, we have a lot of aggression towards Iran from the administration. I'm sure this is mainly driven from Flynn's inability to understand the Middle East and know what side of the war that the Iranians are fighting on. And in fact, in Iraq, you have situations where the Iranians are actually fighting with the Americans, and in Syria, they're fighting with the Syrians, but they're fighting against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, so it's not exactly that the Iranian bad forces in this intervention are in any way hurting the American goals. Or I should clarify that to say, I don't think anything the Iranians are doing are hurting the goals of the American people, not necessarily the American government. In these early days, his personnel, he has Mattis as Secretary of Defense. He hires Giuliani for cybersecurity. Flynn is the National Security Advisor still. Flynn obviously very hawkish on the Middle East. You have Tillerson, who, while I hoped he may be somebody who just knew so little about the situation and was a businessman like commerce, that could lead him to having a very peaceful approach towards Russia. We have Pompeo, the torture mastermind and torture lover being put in place as CIA director, so that was certainly a negative, and he's still sleazing around the CIA. And we have Nikki Haley being approved as U.S. ambassador to the UN. Haley was one where I thought that there was a chance she could be good on these issues because she just had no foreign policy record whatsoever. I don't think she knows anything about foreign policy and is just reading all the things that Samantha Power left her, because she sounds absolutely everything like Samantha Power and has absolutely been a disaster since day one. We also have Trump putting Bannon on the National Security Council. He later gets kicked off this council, and there are some disputes whether maybe Bannon was only on the National Security Council to keep an eye on Flynn. I've heard this story that Bannon never went to the meetings anyways, and they took him off to alleviate some political pressure. However, it does seem that since Bannon has been taking a little bit of a backseat in the Trump administration, it looks more like the hawkish foreign policy towards North Korea and more hawkish towards Assad. We had the botched raid in Yemen occurring around this time. This is kind of the beginning of February. The botched raid is where the U.S. troops went into Yemen and a U.S. soldier ends up dying. They kill a whole bunch of civilians and goats, and the Al-Qaeda guys get away at the end of the day anyways. If you'll remember at his State of the Union, but not State of the Union address, he has this woman's wife, and they all applaud the sacrifice because Trump sent the man to go and die in a foreign country, but nobody, of course, I talked about it then, and I believe this is my podcast where I covered Trump's State of the Union address, which on the foreign policy level is absolutely horrendous. There was nothing in there to like whatsoever. Just his glorification of war with this widow of the veteran who died, and his overall glorification of war was absolutely disgusting. Moving on, we have Trump talking about Gina Haspel and making her the deputy CIA director. Of course, in the media, all you hear is how great of a move this was, and a woman working her way up in the CIA. Unfortunately, this woman tortured and covered up torture at a CIA black site. And so, kind of a Hillary Clinton situation, I do think maybe, you could certainly make an argument saying that there is some importance to having a female president. It shows that a country, who once didn't allow women to vote and women were, didn't have as many rights as men, now being able to hold high positions is significant. However, if you're putting the worst women up there, well, that's not a good example to set. You're not putting the right people up there, and so I think the media really missed the story about the torture and just focused solely on her body parts, and that was unfortunate. We have Trump talking about Israel around this time as well and being somewhat critical of Israel, and this was, I think, one of the bright spots in the early days of the Trump administration, something that you could at least shrug your shoulders and say, well, I'd rather he's doing this than what Obama did. Trump made statements saying that Israel should stop settlement expansion, saying that settlement expansion is hurting a two-state solution. Somebody in the Trump administration said that there is only a one-state solution left. And for a lot of us who are the, anti-war, anti-interventionist, non-interventionist activists, we hope that the U.S. will at the very least stop supporting Israel and hopefully encourage Israel to be more accepting of the Palestinians and stop the settlement expansion. However, it's very, very rare to not have a U.S. president who doesn't take the side of Israel, because Israel has a very powerful lobby in the United States, and it's a good political position to take. It's just politically expedient to support Israel and give Israelis billions of U.S. dollars a year. Even conservative politicians support that money giveaway. The bad news is that he had one of his I believe one of his former attorneys named Freeman was elected or was nominated by Trump and then made ambassador to Israel. He's very much pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian. I think at one point he did say, well, how many Palestinians are there anyways, kind of suggesting that there aren't many Palestinians. This is a line typically people who take the side that, you know, the Israelis should be able to drive the Palestinians out of their land and they have the right to do what they're doing to the Palestinians would say. And that was a black mark on Trump's record and very concerning about his Israel policy. Since this, his Israel policy seems to be much more favorable towards the Israeli regime. Netanyahu has gone ahead and thumbed his nose at Trump and built settlements and allowed illegal settlement expansion and decided to build a settlement road in between two Palestinian villages that Palestinians are allowed to walk on. And it's really been disappointing to see Trump's lack of care on this issue. I'm assuming that he has this guy he likes, Friedman, and he just assumes that he's going to take care of the Israel issue and do all the right things and make Trump look good. Unfortunately, this isn't going to happen. Another very important personnel move in the Trump administration is Flynn resigning after this a scandal that he may have called some Russian guys before or during the election. It's just simply nothingness. I believe it was actually in the transition period between Trump being elected and becoming president that Flynn had talked to a Russian and said something along the lines of Trump will reconsider the sanctions once he takes office. Of course, at that time, Obama was stupidly putting a bunch of sanctions on Russia for, we then have Trump changing his rhetoric on Russia for the first time. I think this is the first time where you start to question what Trump is saying on Russia, because up until this point it's been very friendly, like, I'm going to be friends with Putin, I think I'll get along with Putin, what's wrong with getting along with Russia? And we have Trump's advisors like Nikki Haley and Rex Tillerson and Trump himself coming out and saying that Russia stole Crimea from Ukraine and that Russia needs to give Crimea back to Ukraine before sanctions are relieved. I've said this many times before, but I will say it again. The Crimeans held a referendum vote and chose to join Russia instead of staying as a part of Ukraine, and you could dispute all the stuff that happened before that, but that's what's happened, and people who have been able to get in and poll the election to see if the results, were accurate or not, say that the results were fairly accurate. And it was something like over 90% Crimeans voted to leave Ukraine and join Russia anyways. Crimea is a Russian-speaking place. It made sense that these people would want to be a part of Russia over being a part of the West. And the part that's disputed, but really shouldn't be, because Victoria Nuland was caught telling, I believe it was the EU ambassador, that the EU wasn't moving fast enough on the coup in Ukraine, and she named the guy that she wanted to be the prime minister of Ukraine, and a series of events took place where there was a bunch of protests, a few people were killed, there was a coup, and the elected government of Ukraine was overthrown and a pro-Western prime minister was put in place. This, of course, leads to parts of Ukraine that are in the east and have a lot of native Russians in those areas. Those people kind of resist this and rather be a part of Russia than being part of a pro-West Ukrainian government. One of the reasons that the U.S. really couldn't support the Ukrainian government is a lot of their strongest fighting forces were Nazis, and so the U.S. supporting Nazis isn't a good PR move. So that's certainly part of the story as well. This seems to be where the Trump-Putin relationship went downhill, at least downhill the quickest. Very concerning whenever this started happening, because it seemed like going in, Trump didn't know a whole lot about foreign policy, but maybe that's a good thing, because when he does learn things, he'll learn the right thing over Hillary Clinton, who we already know knows the wrong things, and you're getting something bad with her, but at least with Trump, maybe he, either guesses right or does the right things. But it seems that he's been influenced by his advisors like Bannon and his son-in-law Ivanka's husband Jared Kushner, and is now moving in a very neoconservative direction, certainly becoming a hawk on foreign policy, no longer holding that American first foreign policy. And while there were a lot of bad things in the early days of Trump, this was one of the most concerning. One of the other most concerning pieces in the early Trump administration was the appointment of McMaster to replace Flynn as National Security Advisor. McMaster's is awful. The guy lights large ground forces, ground troops in areas. He's certainly one that thinks that we just need to do more to win the wars. Basically, kind of having the same critique of Americans' foreign policy as all the neoconservatives have, which is if we only would have done more, then it would have worked. This is McMaster's beliefs going all the way back to Vietnam, and since he's really come into office, it seems Trump has become more hawkish on Russia, more hawkish on North Korea, less hawkish on Iran, maybe not less hawkish on Iran, but certainly not more hawkish on Iran, which has allowed the North Korea and Russia stories to really cover up how hawkish he has been on Iran, more hawkish against Assad, more hawkish against Yemen, more hawkish against Somalia, and more hawkish in Afghanistan. A few days after we get the McMaster appointment, it comes to the end of February, and we have the first time the Trump administration starts to get hawkish on North Korea. I think the instigating event here was when the North Korean's leader, I believe maybe brother or some kind of close relative, was assassinated with a nerve agent in Malaysia. That assassination closely lined up with some U.S. talks between the U.S. and North Korea that were about to take place, and once the assassination happened, then the meeting was canceled. I don't think the meeting really needed to be canceled. I mean, maybe he had this guy assassinated, maybe it was some rogue people in North Korea. Who knows who carried out the assassination? Let's just say it was Kim Jong-un. I mean, the guy commits crimes and atrocities all the time. We meet with the leader of Saudi Arabia who's starving the people of Yemen. I mean, George Bush was our president. Like, there's bad people in the world, and sometimes you gotta deal with them. And reducing nuclear weapons and getting this administration off on the right foot between Trump and Kim Jong-un was frankly too important to allow a little nerve agent poisoning of the leader's brother to get in the way of that. And so I don't know if this was Trump's decision or maybe this was a decision made in the State Department without Trump's knowledge even, and it puts Trump in a corner to where now that the meeting is canceled, it kind of starts hostilities off at the beginning of the relationship, and Kim Jong-un and Trump both seem to have kind of that childish personality where they can never let anything go, and they're just going to escalate it. I think in a lot of ways this was just really poorly timed. If you look at certain events in history, maybe they could have occurred at different times in history and wouldn't have meant a whole lot. And so if this meeting is canceled and Kim Jong-un's brother dies in October, I say maybe no big deal. However, this happens at the end of February, and of course the major U.S. and South Korea military drills, where they spend like a month and a half or 2 months basically just simulating the invasion of North Korea over and over again. Every year this happens. Every year Kim Jong-un gets all upset and hot in his chair and starts to test ballistic missiles, does nuclear weapons tests, and generally acts like a child saying, "You're hurting me and this is all I can do to stop it." And so we end up in a situation where this little spark that should have meant nothing ignites a whole big fire because there's a whole, bunch of gasoline coming along, and rather than relations getting started off on the right foot, and then maybe China's plan to have the U.S. stop the military drills in exchange for North Korea stopping nuke testing is agreed upon, and something good could happen, but the water was, the well was poisoned by just this little incident to start off, and it's such a shame that Trump has absolutely no principled foreign policy whatsoever. It's just all about what he feels, apparently, and starting off the relationship with North Korea with a bad taste in his mouth, I think has sent us down a road where this is the situation now. I mean, you have Nikki Haley at the UN and Tillerson at the Secretary of State, the two top diplomats of the United States, through this whole thing sounding like children as well, saying we can't talk to North Korea. North Korea has done too much wrong, and we've tried it all before and it doesn't work, so we're not going to deal with it, and acting like children rather than trying to be adults and talk out the problems. And so I guess right now Nikki Haley is just paid to stand up at the UN and give speeches about how awful Assad and Kim Jong-un are, and never to try to negotiate and end any of these wars that America is involved in and make the American people any safer. She's such a terrible person. So the situation with North Korea started bad then. It has been getting worse. I'm probably not going to talk about it anymore during this podcast. So, it's gone from like I said, the brothers' assassination and then the meeting being canceled to now the U.S. has 3 aircraft carriers in the area, and the USS Michigan is now arriving in North Korea. And something that shouldn't have been a mess at all and was a chance for Trump to get along with a world leader is now a giant catastrophe. Around this same time, we have Trump asking Congress for more defense spending, Trump meeting with Tony Blair, and the most significant event being Trump loosening the restrictions of what the military could do and bomb. And this is something that's generally happened through his presidency, but kind of got going at this time. He declared Somalia and areas of Yemen areas of hostility. This allows the Pentagon to really just carry out raids and airstrikes against these areas as they wish. There's very little oversight with it. This is continued to the point now where he's allowing the Pentagon to set the troop levels in at least Iraq and Syria. I'm not quite sure if that applies to places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Libya, where ISIS exists and is a fighting force against some form of U.S. force in that country. Right at the end of March, we get one of the probably brightest spots in the entire Trump foreign policy, and too bad it only lasted 5 days, and that was Nikki Haley and Rex Tillerson coming out and saying that the U.S. goal in Syria is no longer to get rid of Assad. So yay, the U.S. finally stamps this approval, saying we could get done with this damn Syrian war, and that people could go home and stop fighting at least for a couple years. Assad may be a tyrant, but at least he's not ISIS, and if the U.S. stops funding the rebel groups who are trying to overthrow Assad and stops arming them and stops generally acting in ways that harm Assad, then maybe we could get moving in the right direction on this. But 4 days later, we get the Syrian chemical weapons attack. I don't think this was quite as coincidental as the situation like what happened in North Korea. I think it's very well possible that this may have been a false flag attack aimed to draw the U.S. into more conflict with Assad. It could have been a mistake, and it could have been the chemical weapons or the weapons depot was hit, and this caused a chemical weapons mixtures to be incidentally mixed together and then pour over an area and kill a lot of people. I highly recommend checking out Scott Horn's interview with Theodore Postal to really go into this. This is the conclusion he believes. I think a false flag is very possible, and at the very least, the U.S. government has manipulated evidence to lead the American people to believe that Assad was behind the attack, when in fact, at the very worst, it was Assad accidentally blowing up Syrian rebels' chemical weapons and setting those off, and at the very worst, the Syrian rebels carrying out the attack themselves to draw the U.S. into the conflict even more. A few days after this, Trump decides to bomb Assad, by far the worst foreign policy move of his entire presidency, I believe. Trump hit Assad's airfield. I'm sure we all know this story, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but Assad hit an airfield. Trump launched a bunch of Tomahawk missiles that apparently didn't hit very much, killed 9 people, and it kind of was maybe a show of failure of U.S. weaponry, if nothing else. But it was a sign that the U.S. was now having an Assad must-go stance. Of course, Trump's excuse was Ivanka showed him a bunch of pictures of dying children, and Trump cried and said, okay, I guess I have to now get rid of Assad because Ivanka made me cry. Of course, a couple days later, we have a al-Nusra suicide bombing of a bunch of Syrian civilians targeted at children and killed a bunch of children. More people died in that suicide bombing than the chemical weapons attack, and so it's kind of a head-scratcher why Trump cares cares about some children, not others, but it just goes to show he has absolutely no principles on foreign policy. A few weeks ago, we have Trump saying that NATO is no longer obsolete and that he was wrong when he said that in his campaign promise. So this is, I think, a pretty good sign that Trump is going neoconservative. I think it's entirely possible we see almost a repeat of the Bush presidency if they are able to capitalize on either some American troops dying overseas or a terrorist attack in the U.S. I think they could certainly at this point bait Trump into bigger confrontation. Trump has agreed to send another 1,500 troops to Afghanistan. They'll be getting there this summer, and I know in the past that the general there who is in control of the Afghanistan theater said he needed 5,000 to break the stalemate, so I'm not sure exactly what these 1,500 troops are going to do. I guess it's a good sign, at least that it wasn't more that Trump didn't say, well, you want 5,000, I'll give you 20,000. I could definitely see those words coming out of Trump's mouth. Overall, I think you have to give Trump a pretty big F on foreign policy. Trying to just look at the few positives left kind of coming out of the Trump administration, I would say that it's somewhat not a terrible thing that he wasn't too harsh on the Turkish elections and Erdogan. I think driving a wedge between the U.S. and Turkey is probably a bad thing. If Trump ever does decide that he wants to settle down the war in Syria, he's going to have to put an awful lot of pressure on Erdogan to not keep bombing the Kurds, likely, and also to stop arming and funding Syrian rebels. So I think he has a kind of an interesting relationship that he will have to have with Erdogan if the U.S., wants to overthrow Assad or decide that we're going to help end the Syrian civil war. I think that at least right now, the Iran story isn't really on the front pages, so that's a decent thing. We have had a lot of congressmen say that Trump needs to, ask for another authorization of use of military force if he wants to continue operations in Yemen. So there are some small positives, either because of Trump or from Trump. There's no travel ban in place right now, so I guess we kind of look at that as a positive. I guess it always could be worse. We could be at war with Russia over Ukraine right now. We could be at war with Russia over Syria right now, or Libya, or there's just so many potential conflicts. And so I would say in the next 100 days, there are some things that I would keep an eye on. The first, obviously, being North Korea. That's the hot zone right now. The second is if things in North Korea do cool down as the war games cool off. Who we see the Trump administration again escalating against Iran. If there are any terrorist attacks in the U.S., how does the Trump administration respond? How many bombs do they drop? Do we go to war with another country? That's always really concerning. What does Trump do in Libya, Yemen, and Somalia? In all three of those places, there's a really big humanitarian crisis going on, and the U.S. keeps intervening and keeps making things worse. If Saudi Arabia does go after the port of Hadaya and tries to take that, it will starve a lot of northern Yemen, and if Trump supports that, then the blood's going to be on his hands. In Somalia, we're facing a famine in the south of that country where Al-Shabaab is in power. It seems like Trump is looking to put more forces in that region to combat Al-Shabaab, which will certainly make the conflict worse in that country. Concerning what's going on in those countries, and the longer those countries are at war are, the longer they're going to be in this condition. All this being said, I think the defining moment of Trump's first 100 days was not foreign policy, but I think it was the most important one, and that was when Trump said that he was no longer going after Hillary Clinton. Whenever that happened, I sent one of my buddies who was a Trump supporter, and I said, he's not who you think he is. Certainly on the foreign policy level, we've seen a foreign policy that looks like Hillary Clinton's, and I think if Trump's foreign policy reflects Hillary Clinton's foreign policy, then that's probably why Hillary Clinton isn't in jail, and that Trump is gonna sell out to the big guys. He put Goldman Sachs in his cabinet, and he's not gonna lock up Hillary. He's allowing the military to bomb whoever he wants, and I think it's a pretty bleak time on the foreign policy front. One of the few bright spots has been Trump supporters' reaction to his foreign policy. There is a lot of condemnation from his supporters. That's good to see. So maybe his grassroots will be able to move him. But it looks like the big DC lobbyists, the deep state, got their fangs in Trump Trump, and they're just making him into another George W. Bush. So I don't know what we have to look forward to, except if we could rally a lot of support together and really stick it to him and say, hey, look, everybody hates it, stop doing it. There's a lot of good people who are doing a lot of good work on the foreign policy issues. We got to recruit the left wing in, and we got to tell them now, while they're still hating on Trump, we got to say, hey, whenever the next Democrat does this, you got to hate them too. And so we could draw people into the movement that way. For conservatives, we got to say, look, this guy's selling you a false bill of goods. You got to look somewhere outside of the Republican Party, or you got to push non-interventionists in the Republican Party. And Democrats could certainly do the same thing, but that party is really corrupt, so I don't know. Alright, that'll do it for my coverage of Trump's first 100 days. Not too much positive, a whole lot of negative, but a whole lot of good information here. So if you got anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, please share it with them, tell them to listen to it, give me a rating and review on iTunes. The more we share the show, the more listeners I have. The more listeners I have, the more I know people are learning stuff about foreign policy. So, get it out there, guys. Check out the Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. We talk in there about foreign policy, current events, stuff maybe I talk about on the show, some stuff I don't. Get links to good articles, there's not a whole lot of non-interventionists out there, so it's nice to connect with people who understand your thinking on issues. Check out my Facebook group, Kyle's Files, spelled Fyles, and follow me on Twitter at KYAALE. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.